says this returns. This is so not good.
One of the key changes in reduced federal payments to Medicaid, which provides health care to more than 70 million Americans.
Donors named in the investigation include the idea of editing the genetic makeup of a baby in utero is the stuff of science fiction.
Okay. One of these is missing a back and ounce. Can I write it in? Hey, Ben, can you hear us? Hi, Ben, can you hear us? Hi, Ben. Hi, Ben, can you hear us? Hey, yeah. You're right there. 1 second. So I don't think you can hear my producer, Acacia, but would you mind if we just put you back on hold and you're hanging out? You're going to be talking with me, by the way. Hi, nice to meet you.
Hey, nice to meet you.
Yeah, my name's Pia. So I'm sure that the...
PIA?
Yes, PIA.
Okay, great.
All right, great. We're going to just put you back on hold.
Okay.
Thank you.
So can I just ask one question? So it's going to go billboard.
You're listening to Uptown Radio. It's February 24th. I'm Pia Peterson.
And I'm Sarah Gibson. As legislators consider a bill to legalize assisted suicide, some Catholics find their personal beliefs are at odds with their religious faith.
How I transition out of this earth isn't going to affect anyone else other than myself and my immediate family.
Gun violence is down, in part because formerly incarcerated individuals are getting involved in their communities.
So you need to take former gang members and kind of teach them how to be like social workers on the street.
For college athletes, how are the stakes different in a time of increased activism?
At the end of the day, I'm going to be a black woman when I leave the court, when I leave UConn. So what am I going to do about that?
Transgender students react to Trump's latest bathroom laws, and advances in gene editing raise ethical questions. Today is also the deadline for the city's pre-K registration, and families face challenges in finding diverse classrooms. But first, the news.
NPR News in Washington, I'm Lakshmi Singh. Declaring the era of empty talk is over, President Trump is reaffirming to fellow conservatives a campaign pledge to repeal Obamacare, replace old trade deals with new ones, and build a wall at the U.S.-Mexico border ahead of schedule.
We've defended other nations' borders while leaving ours wide open. Anybody can come in.
His remarks at the annual Conservative Political Action Conference this morning were met with standing ovations. Meanwhile, allegations over Russian ties to the Trump White House persist. NPR's Scott Horsley says the administration denies that White House Chief of Staff tried to pressure the FBI to publicly refute a news story about alleged links between Trump campaign officials and Russian spies.
White House officials angrily refuted a CNN story that Chief of Staff Reince Priebus leaned on the FBI to discount the story, which ran earlier this month in the New York Times. The administration says Priebus merely sought help from the agency after an FBI official told him the Times story was inaccurate. The newspaper had reported U.S. intelligence agencies intercepted multiple phone calls last year between members of the Trump campaign and Russian agents. The White House says while the FBI disputed the Times story, the agency was reluctant to go public with its concerns. Even if the contact with Priebus was initiated by the FBI, it would appear to violate long-standing guidelines designed to insulate the agency from even the appearance of political interference. Scott Horsley, NPR News, Washington.
Well, hours after Press Secretary Sean Spicer held an off-the-record meeting with the press about the stories, the New York Times, Politico, and CNN reported their journalists were blocked from taking part in a press briefing this afternoon. The White House says it simply switched the day's briefing to a smaller pool gathering. The Times wrote that the decision was a highly unusual breach of relations between the White House and its press corps. A car bombing near the Syrian town of Al-Bab that ISIS had claimed has killed at least 51 people. The Syrian Observatory for Human Rights says more than half were civilians. This as Iraqi forces continue their battle against Islamic State. Warplanes attacked ISIS targets in neighboring Syria after militants detonated bombs in Baghdad in recent weeks. In light of the Trump administration's promotion of a travel ban on refugees and people from 7 Muslim-majority nations, Canada is preparing to receive 1,200 Yazidi women and children. Dan Karpinchuk says they're among the most vulnerable refugees in the world.
Canadian officials say the Yazidis will need special counseling and help. They are a religious group that was targeted by ISIS in Iraq. Aid agencies call it genocide. Many of the women and girls were being held as sex slaves by ISIS. Canadian officials say because of that vulnerability, the Yazidi program is being conducted under tight wraps for privacy and security reasons.
That's Dan Karpinchuk reporting. Before the close, the Dow was up 11 points at 20,821. This is NPR News.
In New York, I'm Rebecca Scott. Mayor Bill de Blasio met with federal prosecutors this morning over allegations that he gave preferential treatment to donors who contributed to his 2013 campaign. Some say this could negatively affect his reelection. Republican contender Paul Massey criticized de Blasio for the time the investigation has wasted.
With criminal corruption lawyers, I don't know how, I guess I can understand how things aren't getting done in the city.
Donors named in the investigation include Rabbi Moishe Indig, a businessman and leader in the Satmar Hasidic community in Williamsburg, and Harendra Singh, a restaurant owner. De Blasio will release a statement after the meeting. Governor Andrew Cuomo has ordered that all MTA vehicles be repainted blue and gold, the official colors of New York State. This order comes 3 days after the New York City Transportation Commissioner announced the city would fight to reverse Cuomo's proposed $65 billion cut in the MTA's budget. The order applies to all state vehicles, including police cars, tow trucks, and dump trucks. De Blasio and Cuomo have had a long-time feud over who controls the MTA, and some say the order is part of Cuomo's efforts to heighten the state's presence in New York City. Cell phone users in the New York City area received an Amber Alert around 8:30 this morning for missing 6-year-old Aaliyah Hernandez of Bridgeport, Connecticut. She was later found with her father, Oscar Hernandez, who is currently being held in custody. He is suspected of having fatally stabbed 2 women in Bridgeport, including his daughter's mother. It may be February, but you can't tell as much from the weather. It's been another day of record warmth in New York. Central Park saw a high of 70 degrees. Temperatures will cool tomorrow and Sunday, but unseasonably warm weather will return on Monday for the rest of the week. The 1 train will not run in either direction between 242nd Street and South Ferry from 11:30 p.m. Friday to 5 a.m. Monday. Rebecca Scott, Columbia Radio News.
In breaking news, according to reports from the New York Times and CNN, reporters from these and other outlets, including the Los Angeles Times, Politico, and BuzzFeed, were barred from a White House press briefing today. But the White House has a different take. As part of our ongoing series on the state of the media here at Uptown Radio, we've invited Ben Mullen from the journalism think tank The Poynter Institute to speak with us today. Ben, thanks so much for speaking with us today.
Thanks so much for having me.
So this is an evolving story, and we don't want to be accused of fake news. What happened today?
Yeah, absolutely. The White House periodically has these events called gaggles, which are, just like off-camera briefings that are fairly routine that every news organization that has a correspondent is invited to attend. Today, in a break with tradition, several news organizations, including the New York Times, BuzzFeed, and Politico, were excluded from this gaggle. Several news organizations, including the Wall Street Journal, One American News Network, and Fox News, were admitted to the gaggle. And this sparked no shortage of consternation among the news organizations that weren't admitted, who basically cried foul and said, this isn't the way things are supposed to be.
Yeah, has this ever happened before?
No, not that I can think of. Dean Baquet, the executive editor of the New York Times, released a statement earlier today saying that in the Times' 150-year history of covering, presidents on both sides of the White House, this has never happened before. So it looks like it's a pretty rare, if not unprecedented, event.
Some news organizations, like the Associated Press and Time, chose not to attend the briefing. So how should other news organizations respond to this? Was that a good move to not attend?
It depends on how you think. My personal take on this is that collective action on the part of the press corps is pretty dangerous because as soon as the news organizations start to behave as a single antagonistic body, they run the risk of essentially validating everything the Trump administration is saying about the media being out to get the White House, right? Mm-hmm. So on one hand, it's important that these news organizations, stand in solidarity and make sure that everybody gets the same treatment and nobody gets preferential treatment based on the type of coverage they provide. At the same time, I do worry that protesting over what is essentially, being excluded from one briefing might look like histrionics to the rest of America, who largely already is predisposed to distrust the press. So I can see both sides of it, but I do worry that folks will see the press getting bent out of shape about this, and it might lead them to distrust the press further.
Okay. Why do you think the White House singled out these specific organizations?
Well, to hear the White House talk about it, they released a statement that said essentially, hey, this was just a briefing that we were going to have with just the pooler, so just with the journalist that represents all the news organizations. And the pooler is the person that follows the president around. And then they said, but we decided to add a few other news organizations, among them One American News Network, the Wall Street Journal, and Fox News. So the White House sought to downplay this by saying essentially, you guys, it's not that big of a deal. This was just supposed to be a small gathering in the first place.
Does this set a precedent for future briefings?
Well, I don't know. Judging by the response across the board from all these news organizations, the White House must realize that they've kicked a hornet's nest. So given the Trump administration's sensitivity to media coverage, I doubt if they're going to do this again. Now, that being said, the White House has had a bellicose relationship with the press before, during the campaign, and during the presidential transition. They notably blacklisted several news organizations, including BuzzFeed and the Washington Post. During the transition, the White House said that they would, they threatened to evict the White House press corps from the briefing room and shuttle them to a conference center across the street. So you could view this as an escalation and as evidence that there's more to come. All at the same time, as I said earlier, Trump watches a lot of cable news. He's very attuned to the way that the press behaves. And if this really was an innocent mistake, as the White House is insisting it was, it's possible that they won't make this error in the future so as not to unduly anger the press over a small slight.
Okay. Well, we'll be following this as it develops. Ben, thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks again.
That was Ben Mullen from the Poynter Institute.
President Trump's decision to give powers back to the states on what bathrooms transgender people use is sparking protests around the country. Under President Obama, transgender public school students could use bathrooms that conform with the gender they identify with. The White House says Trump's directive returns decision to the states.
But New Yorkers are taking to the streets to protest. Camila Kerwin reports.
Yesterday evening, frustrated New Yorkers gathered at the iconic Stonewall Inn to share their input about the administration's move. What does this mean to you right now? How are you feeling?
What does it mean to me? It means my survival.
Amid crowds of protesters holding signs reading "Protect Trans Kids" and "Resist," Renee Imparato stands out. She's wearing a bright sweater covered in yellow peace signs and fishnet stockings.
I'm a trans woman. I mean, what does it mean to me? What do you think it means?
Imparato came out as trans 30 years ago. She remembers the day last summer that the Obama administration issued federal protections for trans students.
It was a good thing. A little late.
Late or not, the rights for trans students might see a setback. President Trump says it's not the federal government that should decide how transgender protections play out in public schools, but the states. Michael Freeman, a gay man who's lived in New York for 10 years, isn't buying it.
Oh, no. I mean, with any sort of like LGBT issues, those are all civil rights, and they should all be protected by the 14th Amendment. So they're very much should be left to the federal government to make those decisions for us.
The 14th Amendment, that's the one that forbids states to restrict basic rights, equal protection under laws, life, liberty, and property. So what is the difference between when a state gets to decide on policy and when the federal government gets to decide? Bruce Ackerman teaches law and political science at Yale. He says the difference boils down to one word: humiliation.
It is a fundamental violation of the 14th Amendment to engage in systematic humiliation.
The principle goes back to Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, the Supreme Court school segregation case which said separate but equal isn't good enough. Why? Because it was systematically humiliating for black students. Ackerman said it's the same principle of anti-humiliation the Supreme Court used in its decision to legalize gay marriage. As far as types of decisions states can make, Ackerman says that's all about implementation, how local institutions make rules that reflect federal principles. And it's up to the Justice Department and federal courts to decide whether those decisions amount to systematic humiliation.
But it is a key question to examine with high seriousness. Things are happening much too fast. This is serious business.
This week, the New York City Department of Education issued a statement reiterating its vow to keep its current protocol in place, which allows students to use bathrooms and locker rooms that correspond with their gender identity. Camila Kerwin, Columbia Radio News.
Transgender students in New York may continue to use bathrooms that match their gender identity. That may not be the case in more conservative states like Texas and North Carolina. The Supreme Court is scheduled to hear testimony in late March about a transgendered student in rural Virginia who sued his school for violating Title IX. It's a provision in a 1972 law that protects against sex discrimination in schools that receive federal aid. Elizabeth Bayard is the executive director of GLSEN, an organization dedicated to protecting LGBTQ rights in schools.
That idea is simply obscene. No child in this country should have their rights determined by their zip code. And they also claimed that the reason they were withdrawing the prior guidance is because it was causing confusion. That's also simply untrue.
So you don't think this is surprising?
I'm not surprised at all that they took this step. He has appointed people at the highest levels of his government who are viciously homophobic and transphobic.
Secretary of Education Betsy DeVos didn't seem thrilled about Trump's directive. What do you make of that?
Betsy DeVos has said that she has directed the Office for Civil Rights at the Department of Education to vigorously investigate and enforce any claims of discrimination that come in for all of the most vulnerable students, quote unquote. She did not name transgender students as being in that group. Right now, we need to see some actions that back up those words.
And what are the consequences for trans students if they don't feel safe at school?
The research is so clear. When transgender children are allowed to transition socially, their psychological profiles are the same as anyone else. And when they're not, the risk for suicidality and self-harm and just wasted potential and pain is so outrageous that the idea that Sessions was so hell-bent on having a states' rights victory that he would have it on the backs of children's lives. I'm really at a loss for words.
It seems, based on what we've heard from Governor Cuomo and Mayor Bill de Blasio, that New York City and New York State public schools will retain a lot of safeguards for trans students. But can we talk about places like Texas or North Carolina or other states? Tell us about people you know, students you know, whose lives are about to change in those places as a result of this directive.
What this directive does is actually encourage people to break the law and disregard the civil rights of students. The fact is that a child in Texas has the same rights under federal law as a child in New York. And the purpose of the Department of Education as a civil rights agency is to ensure that that child in Texas is afforded the same opportunities as a child in New York that are theirs by right. The idea that the rights of a child should be subject to the whims of their state is frankly obscene and un-American.
We've heard disapproval from advocates and civil rights organizations. What are the next steps to either push back against this directive or fight this in court?
Well, the most important thing to remember is that transgender students have the same rights today that they had on Wednesday before they took this outrageous step. The only question is whether the Department of Education is going to enforce them. So for us at GLSEN, our primary interest is, one, making sure that schools know that the practices that were promulgated with this guidance have been in place, in fact, in many schools that are trying to do the right thing, and they've been in place for years without any incidents and without any problems. The only problems that have been created here are by politicians who are making hay off of children's lives.
That's Eliza Bayard, director of GLSEN, the Gay, Lesbian, and Straight Education Network. Thanks so much for talking with us.
Thank you so much.
The New York State Assembly is again looking at a bill to legalize physician-assisted death. If New York passes the bill, it will be the sixth state to allow people with terminal illnesses to hasten their death.
The bill is contentious, and there are major obstacles.
Mainly, many religious communities say it is against God's will to hasten your death. Lindsay Cortica has more.
Susan Braun is 46. She lives in Rochester. She used to be a recruiter for a technology company. Now, she works with the terminally ill. That's because a few years ago, she was diagnosed with stage 4 breast cancer.
At that stage, once the cancer has gone into a vital organ, the bones, liver, lungs, or brain, then there is no cure.
Ron says she doesn't want to die a painful, drawn-out death. That patients like her should get more options at the end of their lives. That's why she supports the new bill. But there's a problem. Her church opposes it.
I really don't think this is something that the Catholic Church really needs to take a hard stance on, because there are so many other religious leaders that understand that it's about compassion and treating other people as autonomous and letting them make their own decisions about their own bodies.
At St. Catherine of Siena Priory on the Upper East Side, Catholics gather to plan to fight the bill that Ron supports. The crowd eats pastries off of paper plates and drinks coffee out of styrofoam cups. Marianne Reno is a nurse from Long Island. She's worked in hospice for years.
My heart breaks to think that this is even a thought. It's murder.
Reno says her husband had a brain tumor and died naturally. She says even though he suffered towards the end, it was a holy act. She believes patients should wait until God calls them instead of choosing what she calls suicide. Many Catholics say they don't want the sick to suffer. It's okay to take someone off of life support, but they are worried about unnecessarily speeding patients' deaths. Ed Meckman is a lawyer and the director of public policy for the New York Catholic Archdiocese.
My son attempted to commit suicide a few years ago, so I'm particularly sensitive to a culture that may affirm suicide as a good option. It is a terrible message to send if at the end of life they are unable to do their normal functions or that their life is no longer worth living.
Meckman recently filed a court brief against the bill on behalf of the New York State Catholic Conference. Amy Paulin is the bill's sponsor. She says physician-assisted death isn't suicide. It's no different from removing a person from life support. And without that option, patients often refuse water and food, a slow and painful way to die.
I find it somewhat ironic that the choice of withdrawing life support, the choice of withdrawing food, the choice of withdrawing meds, the choice of withdrawing liquid isn't considered by the Catholic Church identical to fast-pacing someone's death.
And that's what Susan Rahn, the advocate for the terminally ill, says she agrees with, despite Catholic teachings she was raised with.
How I transition out of this earth isn't going to affect anyone else other than myself and my immediate family. I have a 17-year-old son that I wish for him not to watch me go through that process.
A vote in the spring will determine if that ultimately will be the case. Lindsay Cordica, Columbia Radio News.
The idea of editing the genetic makeup of a baby in utero is the stuff of science fiction.
Last week, a group of top scientists published a paper supporting limited testing of genetically modifying human babies. But, as Sushmita Pathak reports, it's raising ethical questions of where to draw the line.
It's a Saturday afternoon at Gigi's Playhouse, an indoor play space in Harlem.
And we can put it down right past this ramp, so you go down on the mat.
The kids are building a hurdle race with mats, a ramp, and a trampoline.
Ooh, what if we used some cones and you had to go around the cones? Yeah.
The kids are of different ages and backgrounds, but they have one thing in common: an extra copy of chromosome 21, Down syndrome. Alfredo is watching his 13-year-old daughter Abigail play. He says she's no different from any of his other kids.
She's a teenager, so teenagers give you a little bit of headache. She's falling in love now, you know what I mean? So yeah, I'm facing every challenge that any parent would face.
Some genetic conditions like Down syndrome can be detected through prenatal testing. But what if you could fix the condition in utero? Last week, a National Academy of Sciences report said, in the future, technology might allow scientists to edit the genes to prevent serious genetic conditions, even before the baby is born. But Marcy Darnowski says this opens up an ethical minefield. She's with the Center for Genetics and Society in California. And she says once gene editing technology is out there, it will be very hard to regulate.
It would very likely wind up, we're afraid, being used for purposes of so-called enhancement.
Enhancements like blue eyes or an athletic build, so-called designer babies. And Darnowski says wealthy people who'd be able to afford the technology could use it to become genetically superior.
And, I think what we need in this world is less social inequality, not more.
It's even more concerning because these genetic modifications would be heritable, meaning they would be passed down to future generations. The new gene would become a part of the traits that are handed down, or what scientists call the germline. And if, God forbid, something went wrong with that gene, it would stay with us. And this bothers Darnowski and others in the scientific community.
And that actually flies in the face of a very widespread global agreement that the so-called human germline should remain off limits.
Darnowski says even in putting the idea out there, the report goes too far. John Entine says it doesn't go far enough. He's the founder of Genetic Literacy Project, a nonprofit organization.
We want to set up a flexible enough system to encourage innovation, but also to allow for us to put on the brakes when necessary. This, I think, is putting on the brakes even before the train's out of the station.
Brakes because the report recommends caution. He says those who talk of catastrophic scenarios of what might happen are shackling innovation for no reason.
The reality of it is that if you try to squelch innovation in the United States through regulation, it's just going to happen in places that have far less ethical constraints that are in place in the United States.
So he's putting down some cones that you're going to have to go around.
Back in Gigi's Playhouse in Harlem, I asked Abigail's dad about what having a child with Down syndrome means when in the future kids like Abigail could be, quote, corrected.
Well, science is always trying to improve the quality of human life. I would not change my choice if I could, because the person that I have in Abigail is someone that adds a lot of value and a lot of happiness to us.
Alfredo says it's not about right or wrong, it's about choice. Ultimately, scientists will have to grapple with the question of if we can, should we? Sushmita Pathak, Columbia Radio News.
New Yorkers generate approximately 22,000 tons of trash per day.
That's 22,000 tons of trash per day. Mayor de Blasio has said that as early as 2030, he wants all trash to be either recycled or composted. He calls it his zero waste initiative.
But today, about 3/4 of the trash is not sorted. To try to get a better understanding of what it would take to get people to separate their trash, one group is approaching it like scientists. Our reporter, Devin Brisky, sifted through the trash.
It's 9 a.m. on an NYU loading dock. Workers move boxes in and out of trucks. Tessa Rosenberry is standing next to a cluster of trash bags, and it stinks.
Yeah, it smells a little bit gross. A little bit like trash has been spilled on the floor many, many times, which is true. Smells kind of familiar.
She's been going through trash bags from the NYU Student Center for the past 2 years. Today, she's telling Rupal Mehta what to look for.
Wait, there was a balloon in there?
Was that?
There was a balloon in the trash?
Yeah, there was.
With gloves on, they take each item out. It's like an archaeological dig. Rosenberry holds up each object and examines it closely, looking for brand and manufacturer.
Coffee lid, rigid plastic, no brand, so you'll type in unknown. And then the manufacturer, I think is Aspen, A-S-P-E-N.
One of Rosenberry's colleagues keeps track. When they're done, they put it into 6 bins behind them. They're labeled liquids, organics, paper, rigid and soft plastics, metals, and more. Her goal is to figure out why so many compostables and recyclables end up in the trash. She's a trash scientist. She's learned a lot from waste, and she thinks others can too.
With enough data on certain wastes by a certain brand, we can go back to that store or whatever it might be and say, hey, we have this information about how much waste you're producing and how much of it ends up at NYU. Could we theoretically work together to maybe work towards a zero waste program at your store?
She also goes back to the bins where the trash was collected originally and posts a running tally of how the students are doing. She's trying to figure out whether this information will encourage people to sort their own trash. She says there are 3 main reasons why people don't recycle: apathy, confusion, and
doubt. So people not trusting that the effort that they're going through to recycle is really being followed through on.
Engineering student Rupal Mehta has been inspired to start composting.
So at home, we have one for landfill and one for recycling, but I think we should probably expand that to more, not just put everything that we think that is recyclable in it. And now I guess I know what you can compost and not compost. That's pretty good.
Pretty good and could be better. Tessa Rosenberry will be back next week sorting trash again. Devin Brisky, Columbia Radio News.
You're listening to Uptown Radio.
There's more to come. Stay with us. You're listening to Uptown Radio. I'm Pia Peterson.
And I'm Sarah Gibson. Coming up, concerned constituents are increasingly voicing their political concerns in their representatives' town hall meetings.
Breaking down ongoing questions about race and diversity at this year's Oscars. And African immigrants facing concerns in the wake of Trump's immigration ban. But first, the news.
In New York, I'm Lindsay Cordica. This afternoon, the White House blocked major news organizations from participating in a news briefing. Specifically, CNN, the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, and Politico were barred. The Associated Press and Time magazine boycotted the briefing as a result. This comes after President Trump's remarks earlier today at the Conservative Political Action Conference, or CPAC, where he railed against the media, particularly unnamed sources.
They shouldn't be allowed to use sources unless they use somebody's name. Let their name be put out there. Let their name be put out. A source says that Donald Trump is a horrible, horrible human being. Let him say it to my face.
Trump treated this morning's conference like a campaign rally, referencing a second attempt to restrict travel from Muslim-majority countries, as well as lowering taxes and repealing the Affordable Care Act. Even though it has been months since Trump's election win, the crowd chanted, "Lock her up." Trump praised the work of immigration officers' efforts to remove undocumented immigrants from the country.
They shouldn't be allowed to use sources unless they use somebody's name. Let their name be put out.
Today, White House Chief of Staff Reince Priebus confirmed he asked FBI officials to keep quiet about Trump administration communications with Russian intelligence. FBI Director James Comey reportedly refused to comply with the request, though he did give permission to say intelligence officials' press reports were inaccurate. President Trump today also signed an executive order that will require every federal agency to establish a regulatory reform task force. The aim will be to eliminate red tape in regulatory agencies. A Pennsylvania judge ruled today that one additional witness can testify at Bill Cosby's sexual assault trial, making 2 total accusers. While this was a tiny victory for prosecutors, the judge did not ultimately allow testimony from 13 additional women the prosecutor requested. The FBI has joined a possible hate crime investigation today in Kansas. That's after Adam Purinton allegedly opened fire in a bar Wednesday night, killing 1 and injuring 2. Witnesses say Purinton yelled, "Get out of my country," before shooting the 3 men who are of Indian descent. Stocks fell slightly today, which put the Dow in its first downward streak in over a week. The A&D trains are experiencing delays. It was a high of 67 today. Tomorrow will be a high of 58 with a 90% chance of rain. Sunday will be sunny with a high of 46 degrees. Lindsay Cordica, Columbia Radio News.
I'm Sarah Gibson.
And I'm Pia Peterson. It's been 5 weeks since Trump took office, and Democratic politicians are trying to learn how to lead the opposition party.
For many, that means connecting with their outraged constituents through town hall meetings during the winter recess. One of them was Yvette Clarke, a Democrat from Brooklyn. Camila Kudelska was there.
At 6, a whole hour before Congresswoman Clarke takes the stage, the auditorium is filling up. For some Brooklyn residents, it's the first opportunity to take the action on the streets to a face-to-face conversation with their legislators. Angela Welsh says it's exciting.
I think that we've been living under the illusion that as in a democracy we don't have to be involved. So that's kind of exciting to get people waking up to the fact that we do.
By 6:30, the room is full. There's even an overflow room, and a line snakes around the block outside. Finally, Congresswoman Yvette Clarke enters the room.
Yvette Clarke is in the House.
It almost feels like she's a rock star, and the Congresswoman really plays to the crowd as she mentions the people behind Trump's recent travel ban.
The architects of the executive order, Steve Bannon, Stephen Miller, and Rudy Giuliani. I know.
She continues to throw in the punches.
And then Kellyanne Conway.
But for so many people that were calling representatives and trying to take action in the past couple of months, this is a chance to feel closer to the action in D.C. And for Clarke, it's heartening. So when it comes time for the Q&A, they get down to business on ethics, immigration, and healthcare. Even when one person confronts Clarke about not signing on to a bill, Clarke takes it with stride.
That's a good question. It sounds like something I need to be on. My staff from D.C. are here. They'll make sure that happens immediately. That's what town halls are all about.
A little later, it turns out Clarke says she is signed on the bill. She really pushes the crowd to get the word out to people in more conservative areas.
We need to build common cause with others of like mind in their districts. And Brooklynites have a way of charging people up. And I think that we need to help bolster and support them to really push their representative to do right by them.
By the end of the night, 3 ladies, Leah Margelis, Julia Verens, and Amy Shire, wearing their pink hats, munch on donuts.
Well, this is more a love fest because we all agree. It was fun.
For me, it was great to hear from her about strategies we can think about to support the Democratic Party in Washington and then the Democratic Party across the country.
I was very, very encouraged and more even inspired by her. So I think these town halls are wonderful.
Lucky for Shire, Clark says she will hold many more town halls in the future. Meanwhile, she's created a hashtag Brooklyn Resist. Mila Kadalska, Columbia Radio News.
President Trump is working to replace the Affordable Care Act. One key part of his plan would greatly reduce federal payments to Medicaid, which provides health care to more than 70 million Americans. Kristen Schwab reports from a senior center in Brooklyn.
When 70-year-old Brooklyn resident Virginia Malloy picked up her thyroid prescription at the pharmacy last week, she was handed an unexpected bill.
And all of a sudden, they changed the tier levels, and I now have to pay $10 a month.
Before last week, Malloy's medication was free. She admits $10 for medication may not sound drastic, but that's just for one prescription. And for a retiree in New York City, every dollar counts. It's hard to say if the price of Malloy's medication was affected by Donald Trump's Affordable Care Act proposal, but one thing is clear. The 30 or so seniors who gathered this morning at Swinging 60 Senior Center are worried about what's to come. They're finishing their dollar breakfast of oatmeal and coffee when Congresswoman Carolyn Maloney arrives.
How's the food? Very good.
She's here to address their concerns, but no one quite knows how Trump's proposed changes will affect seniors. So it's hard to have a conversation when all you have are what-ifs.
We do know that the new Republican plan will aim to phase out Medicaid expansion, which has helped bring health care coverage to millions of low-income Americans.
Thomas Diano, the director of NYU's Health Policy and Management program, agrees. The details are hazy. He's also left guessing. He says the future of Medicaid and Medicare could go in a few directions. Option 1, Medicare becomes privatized and seniors shop for their own insurance.
On the surface, that seems very reasonable.
But he says it's not.
There's a good deal of research which shows that individuals, including seniors, have a hard time choosing among insurance plans and oftentimes will choose plans that are not optimal for their needs.
Other options, Diano says, cuts to the Medicare budget, which could mean a downgrade in the quality of care, defunding the Center for Medicare Innovation, which looks to fill gaps in Medicare coverage, and lastly, cutting resources for the 9 million low-income seniors who qualify for both Medicare and Medicaid. Diano's assessment?
Certainly some of the policy proposals don't look good. They don't look promising for lots of seniors across the United States.
Back at the senior center, Virginia Malloy is not feeling hopeful.
We're just the forgotten ones, the seniors, now that, they want to almost like putting us on a block of ice and send us out to sea or something. I think it's going to be hard for all of us.
Proposed changes to the Affordable Care Act are open for public comment until March 7th. Kristen Schwab, Columbia Radio News.
Since Black Lives Matter protests began, more Black athletes have been outspoken about civil rights, including top sports superstars and younger players. Just last week, the high school boys basketball team at Kobe Bryant's alma mater in Philadelphia wore black T-shirts in solidarity with Muslim immigrants.
But for elite college athletes, speaking out can be complicated. The University of Connecticut women's basketball team continued its historic winning streak this week, and players are keeping to the sidelines of any political debate. Acacia O'Connor reports.
At the XL Center in Hartford Wednesday night, the Yukon Huskies are doing what they do best, winning. A fervent call and response cheer is underway. But if you're looking for signs of the current political climate, there's not much to see. The only poster boards are giant cutouts of players' heads. Still, freshman point guard Crystal Dangerfield says she's seen protests on campus.
Just seeing it around school, there are things going on, like rallies being held. It's great that they're taking the effort to go do that and have something structured. And wish I could join, but can't get to everything.
Life is busy when you're a part of one of the greatest collegiate sports programs in history. But if the Huskies win the national championship this year, for the 5th year in a row, the team will get invited to the White House. And at this moment in time, that will spark a debate about whether they'll go and why. Sociologist Fritz Polite teaches sports management at Shenandoah University. He says athletes have a history of protest.
We always have had activism in sport. Serena Williams did it. Jackie Robinson did it. Muhammad Ali did it. Billie Jean King did it.
But these athletes were professionals at the top of their game. College athletes? They're still trying to get to the top, where contracts and multi-million-dollar endorsements await. That can make protesting as an individual a big gamble. But to badly paraphrase Margaret Mead, never underestimate a small group of thoughtful, committed jocks. Take the University of Missouri football team. 2 years ago, the entire team threatened a boycott over racial comments. And the president of the university system and its chancellor resigned.
And they were solidified in their movement. 100%. Every single player, not one single player, not one broke the line.
That's Polite again. He says that little by little, younger generations of athletes have begun to realize their power.
People don't come to see the coach. They come to see the players. That is what young people are starting to realize, that they can impact change. We're not going to play the game. We're not going to go to practice. We demand certain inalienable rights.
Back in the UConn Players Lounge, junior forward Gabby Williams says she feels the team's power to affect change, especially if they stick together.
As a team, we have an amazing platform that not a lot of people have.
On the night of her own monumental achievement, she scored her 1,000th point in Wednesday's game. Williams says things are changing.
At the end of the day, I'm going to be a black woman when I leave the court, when I leave UConn. So what am I going to do about that? And I think a lot of athletes are starting to think that way.
The Huskies' win over Temple on Wednesday put them one game closer to the championship and the White House. Williams says whether they go or don't go, it's a decision the team will make together. Acacia O'Connor, Columbia Radio News.
The 89th Academy Awards is this Sunday night. That means it's been a full year since the hashtag #OscarsSoWhite, and things are definitely different this time around.
Convincing Hollywood that diverse stories are worth spending money on is going to take a little more work. Eric Deggans is the first full-time TV critic at NPR. My co-host, Pia Peterson, asked him about what he thought of this year's Oscar nominations.
Well, the first thing that occurred to me was that in the midst of the Oscar So White controversy last year, a lot of people in the film industry kept saying, the problem is that there's not enough films in the pipeline, and it's going to take time to get the kind of films that would be Oscar-worthy. And then the Academy took the bold and necessary step of inducting several hundred new members who were much more diverse and much younger than their average membership. And then lo and behold, a year later, we have several films that are considered Oscar-worthy that star non-white actors or center on non-white culture. And now you see a movie like Hidden Figures. It's dramatizing a pivotal moment in the struggle for black people to get equal recognition and acceptance in society. And, not only is it nominated for Best Picture, but one of its actors gets an acting nomination as well. You get the sense that maybe the Academy paid attention to the criticism, is trying to be a little more expansive in its thinking, and at the same time maybe the industry is leaning towards movies that would lend a little more diversity to the kinds of Oscar bait movies that we see come out at the end of the year.
Do you wonder why there aren't more actors of color being cast in lead roles alongside white actors? I mean, for example, what would La La Land look like with a black female lead?
No, I don't wonder, because I know exactly that's happening. What it is it's a constant struggle to convince Hollywood and the media companies that bankroll these films, that stories about non-white people and culture can make money, can result in profitable, buzzworthy, successful movies. From my standpoint, I think the problem still is that certain stories are valued more than others. Certain stories are seen as valuable, as more valuable. And the struggle is always to convince people that when a movie like Hidden Figures comes along and makes a lot of money, that it's not a fluke. That if you make a good movie that's centered on non-white characters, it'll make money. Hopefully, Hollywood is learning this lesson and realizing that they can widen their lens a little bit and increase the pipeline.
So you talk about different cultures being represented, and while there are a lot of black actors represented this year, I think 6 out of the total 20 nominations for acting, people are also calling for more diversity as far as Latino actors, Asians, South Asians. What do we need to really call this diverse?
Well, I mean, for me, it's always an ongoing process. When you have one pivotal move forward, then you have to press for the next move forward and the next and the next. As much as people might want to feel good about the historic number of nominations for black actors, you have to turn around and say, why does Hollywood always equate quote-unquote diversity with black people?
Well, this year's Oscars, are you expecting them to be more political than usual?
Yeah, I guess everybody is. I thought I remembered seeing a news story somewhere that said that one of the producers or organizers of the Oscars sort of, told people that if they felt like they had to say something, to go ahead and say it. We've seen so many performers speak out at award shows that it has become an expected thing. And when it becomes an expected thing, I think sometimes it loses some of its power.
Eric, thank you so much for speaking with us today. We really appreciate having you on.
Thanks a lot.
That was Eric Deggans, NPR's TV critic and the author of Race Baiter, How the Media Wields Dangerous Words to Divide a Nation. A new report from the Pew Research Center says the African immigrant population of legal and undocumented residents in the United States has more than doubled in the last 15 years, up to just under 5% of the total immigrant population.
But immigrants from African countries also have a disproportionate rate of deportation compared to other immigrant groups. Advocates say the fear in the community is palpable. Taylor Wisner has more.
Lawrence Biebra is from Sierra Leone. He works as a security guard in Manhattan, and he is the sole financial supporter of his extended family back home. He came to the U.S. on a visitor's visa in 2014. Then his country was overtaken by Ebola, and he was granted temporary protective status, or TPS, to stay in the U.S. He says that while many perceive the public health crisis in Sierra Leone is over, the country is still devastated from the disease.
They might say it's end, but the aftermath is still disastrous.
The Obama administration canceled the TPS program for countries affected by Ebola, but it extended the visas a few times. Now Biebra's visa is set to expire at the end of May. He's nervous but remains optimistic.
We are pleading, we are hoping, we continue to appeal. The time is short, but we continue to appeal until we see whatever.
Biebra is just one of the many African immigrants whose stay in the U.S. might get shortened. That's according to Amaha Casa, an immigration attorney and the director of the nonprofit African Communities Together. Casa says Trump's administration has targeted black immigrants with his executive orders. Right now, undocumented Africans face a higher risk of deportation.
This rhetoric around, criminal aliens has been very vague, very broad, and very sweeping. So it includes potentially people who don't have any conviction, who might be wrongly picked up and ultimately cleared of any crime, but still face this very severe penalty.
Since the president's recent executive orders on immigration were released, Casa says Africans have been calling the hotline for advice. Callers are scared they'll be deported.
People who've been here for many years, some of them even with green cards, because we've seen that even green card holders have gotten swept up in some of the immigration enforcement and visa ban. And also just for folks who are undocumented and who at the moment don't have any relief available to them, a lot of fear.
Benjamin Ndoga Kabuya is a researcher at Black Alliance for Just Immigration. He says it's not just Africans that are at risk. Racial bias plays a role, so all Black immigrants are more likely to have encounters with the police. That means more of them could be deported, especially when there's a focus on smaller crimes.
Broken windows policing basically means that low-level offenses are going to be targeted with arrests and fines. And so a number one arrest in New York City is for jumping the turnstile. About 30,000 people get arrested every year for that.
Ndoga Kabuya says when you're arrested in New York City, police officers share that information with the Department of Homeland Security and ICE. And that can make it easier for immigrants or refugees to be deported.
This administration has intensified. This is an expansion increase. So things are much worse, but it's also built on the past.
Biabura's wife and children are living in Mauritania, which neighbors Sierra Leone. He says if he is deported to Sierra Leone, he might not be able to cross the border because neighboring countries are still afraid of Ebola. Meanwhile, he's applying to study business in the U.S., hoping the country might let him stay a bit longer. Taylor Wisner, Columbia Radio News.
Commentator Hannah Long Higgins recently had 2 close encounters with death on a single afternoon, one as a reporter and another as a civilian.
A few weeks ago, I was walking down the street in Harlem on my way to photograph a source when I saw a man lying in the middle of Broadway. His arms were at his sides, perfectly straight, and he wasn't wearing shoes. Traffic was stopped behind him, and a small cluster of onlookers had gathered on the sidewalk next to the road. I thought maybe the man had been hit by a car or had a heart attack, so I ran toward the scene. As a journalist, normally one of my first instincts is to grab my camera. But this time, I raced forward, prepping myself to do CPR, thinking I could save him. But his body was eerily still. I soon found out the man in the street had just jumped from a nearby subway platform, which sits about 20 feet above the road. A tall, bald man on the sidewalk had one hand over his mouth and the other on top of his head. It was a posture I recognized as shock. He removed his hand from his mouth long enough to shout, "We tried to stop him. We told him not to." Someone placed a blue rain jacket over the body, and I stood there for a moment in silence on the sidewalk with the other onlookers. By the time the police showed up, I was already on a downtown 1 train. As the train pulled away from the station, I could see lights of an ambulance flashing below. The woman sitting next to me on the train was filling out a crossword puzzle with a ballpoint pen. A few people sitting across from me looked tired and bored. For them, this was just another commute. I felt sick to my stomach. I was angry with them for being oblivious to the tragedy that had just played out at the station. How could something so shocking happen and life continue to play out around me as if nothing had happened at all? By the time I finally arrived to meet my source an hour later, I was weary. My source's son answered the door and asked why I was so late. I told him, "A man killed himself at my subway station." His face registered no emotion. "Oh, come on in. I'll give you a tour." At first I thought he didn't hear me, but then it hit me. He had troubles of his own. Down the street, his elderly father was lying in a hospital bed, slowly dying, and the father and son were being evicted from their home. I felt a wave of exhaustion sweep over me. This was my second encounter with death in just 1 day, and I couldn't save this man either. Together we walked up the road to the hospital to see his father. When we entered the hospital room, I instinctively reached in my backpack to pull out my camera. It was only then, once I felt the weight of my camera in my hands, that I remembered why I had gone to meet this man in the first place. In the face of this death, I had a job to do, and that sense of purpose carried me through the rest of the day and all the way home.
Hannah Long Higgins is a journalism student in New York City. As New York City crime rate continues to decline, taxpayers still spend billions on crime prevention. The majority goes to the NYPD, the court system, and correctional facilities. But a tiny percentage goes to one surprising program, Credible Messengers. Former gang members and their neighbors work together to mediate conflict before shots are fired and the police are called in. After a decade of working under the radar, the program is getting more attention. My co-host Sarah Gibson reports from Queens.
When you enter the Credible Messenger's office in South Jamaica, the first thing you notice is that everyone is wearing orange. Darren Goodman says there's a good reason.
If you ever been hunting, they make you put on these bright orange hats, right? And you're not supposed to shoot at us, right?
Goodman is in charge of a group of messengers whose daily job it is to scan the neighborhood for signs of brewing violence and intervene. He says the orange reassures people.
We not here to do you no harm. We're here to mediate and bring peace, right? And that's our uniform.
Before this uniform, Goodman wore a prison jumpsuit. He spent 15 years behind bars, and that's not surprising for a credible messenger. The idea here is that people who were once part of street life have credibility with their neighbors, who are the likely victims and perpetrators of violence. Many messengers have spent time in prison, but not all. Carolyn Dixon is known in this neighborhood simply as Ma. She has gray dreadlocks and is wearing an orange hoodie with a peace sign.
Can you tell me about why you do this work?
Because I lost my son to gun violence May 5th, 2014 over a parking space. He was murdered in front of me. So I believe that no one else knows a family or a mother's pain or a father's pain unless you've been through it yourself.
Dixon's son was murdered just 2 blocks away from this office, and since then there have been no gunshot deaths in this area. Some of the decline is thanks to the police, but even when the NYPD is doing its job, it's by nature reactive. Credible messengers have to be proactive. The idea is to de-escalate so that no one has to call the NYPD and arrest someone. But if gunshots have already been fired, Dixon is on the front lines.
We'll get a text that someone got shot. We try to find the family members. We show emotional support, and we try to stop retaliation.
So what does success for Dixon look like? If she does her job well and crime decreases, the NYPD reports won't show much. That's good, mostly, but it makes it hard for researchers like Jeffrey Butts who want to evaluate what works. Butts has spent years studying this. He says the credible messenger sites can be disorganized and inefficient, but they're still a good investment, especially when you consider how little credible messengers cost the city.
You could double the salaries of every person that works in these programs, and it would still be a good buy. I would say the justice approach, the police and prosecution approach, probably costs 4 times as much.
Mayor de Blasio's office seems to agree. His new budget proposal includes $4 million more for this program than last year. Butts says this is sorely needed to improve training for incoming messengers.
You need more than just the credibility of your former life. So you need to take former gang members and kind of teach them how to be like social workers on the street.
Back in Queens, Doran Goodman and Carolyn Dixon say some of that funding needs to go to messengers' wages, which for full-time employees starts at $32,000. They both think it's time to get the kind of respect that's given to police.
Because we do work just like police officers, we just don't carry a gun.
We don't wear no bulletproof vests or no protective armor, and we out here mediating conflicts from the front end. So we are going to take that chance. Like, my daughter needs to come outside and play. So the work I do is making that possible.
And that additional training researchers talk about, turns out 18 credible messengers are getting that right now. Carolyn Dixon and other messengers from across the city are attending the first college-accredited class specifically designed to provide training and support for this work. It's at the New School, and Dixon says it's the most important class she's ever taken. Sarah Gibson, Columbia Radio News.
Mayor de Blasio's Pre-K for All plan marks its 3rd anniversary today. It guarantees a free education for every 4-year-old in the city.
And today is the final day New York City parents can submit their applications for pre-K. But parents looking for a diverse program for their child could face an uphill battle. And advocates say the city is missing an opportunity to address segregation at the earlier stages of a child's education.
Reporter Mike Elson-Rooney has the story.
Janae Lucius lives in Washington Heights, and she's facing a big change next year.
I have to go to pre-K next year. It's going to be for big kids, and they do what their teachers tell them to do and behave.
It's also a big day for her mom, Mariela Montilla. Janae is already enrolled at Hudson Guild Daycare in Chelsea, and she'll likely have a spot in its pre-K next year. Montilla loves the school, and she works downtown so she can bring Janae to school every day. But the commute is starting to wear on them.
So we get on the train and commute together down here, which is, a little bit difficult because the commute in New York City is tough on adults. Imagine on a 4-year-old.
Still, Montia says Hudson Guild brings advantages that she can't find in her own neighborhood.
When we are by my house, it's mostly predominantly Hispanic, same people she sees all the time, So I wanted her to be exposed to different cultures, different languages.
Montia says the Chelsea school draws a diverse array of parents, and her daughter has noticed.
She's come home and said, "Hey, Mommy, people have accents, and they're from other places," which is not something she ever noted at her other daycare. That's awesome.
But Montia may be an exception to the rule. Hallie Potter studies pre-K diversity for the Century Foundation, a think tank. She says many parents can't travel and don't even know about pre-K programs outside of their neighborhoods, so they stick to what's close by.
Right now, geography is usually the only factor that parents really know about.
Potter says we're not giving parents a full array of options. 60% of pre-K students are in privately run neighborhood centers, and those programs are often the most segregated.
And those programs, in many ways, have some of the greatest opportunities for potential diversity. But I think in order for many of those programs to really create diverse enrollment, they need support in terms of being able to do the marketing and outreach to families of different backgrounds.
Schools Chancellor Carmen Farina weighed in recently on pre-K segregation. She said if parents choose to stay in their neighborhoods, there's not much the city can do about it. But Potter doesn't buy that argument. She says the city could start by providing better information to parents.
There's still a lot more about the quality and the nature of a program that I think parents would be interested to learn about.
And for parents who do want to leave their neighborhood, Potter says the city could provide assistance, like subsidies for public transportation. In the meantime, for Montia, the stakes are high. In a year's time, she'll be looking for a kindergarten for her daughter and hopes to prepare her for the gifted and talented exam. She's glad for the flexibility she had to choose a pre-K program, but she knows that not all families are in the same position. Mike Elson-Rooney, Columbia Radio News.
Wrapping up today's broadcast of Uptown Radio, we'd like to thank the people who made the show possible.
Meg Dalton led this team as executive producer. Our senior producer, Melissa Cáceres, worked with Mike Elson-Rooney and Emily Dugdale.
Senior editor Camila Kudeska and assistant editor Max Hopman led our copy team.
Director Acacia O'Connor coordinated our studio production with Shushmita Pathak and Taylor Wisner.
Our webcaster, Hannah Long-Higgins, got the stream live to the web.
Radio professors Carrie Donahue, Joe Richmond, Sally Herships, and Asa Secker advised our staff. I'm Sarah Gibson.
And I'm Pia Peterson. Uptown Radio is live on Fridays at 4. Until next week, you can always find us on uptownradio.org. From all of us here at Uptown Radio, thanks for listening.